my name is Lauren.
Hi, I'm Emmett.
My name is Emma.
Hi, my name is Erin McQuillan.
My name is Yune.
Today I'm going to talk to you about tips for the UCAT from my perspective as a student. Hopefully you'll find that helpful.
Preparing for the UCAT can be a very stressful time, and I personally thought it was the most difficult part of my application to medical school.
My first tip is that you must go to the UCAT website and familiarise yourself with the important dates and testing times, because there are different dates for first registration, first booking, first test date, and then therefore there are also deadlines that you must register by, book by, and sit your test by.
At the start of my revision, I would spend as much time as I could to fully understand each question and how would I approach the question if I saw it again, for example.
I would recommend starting with tutorials and then videos as well, just at the beginning of your preparation so that you can get a feel for the UCAT, familiarise yourself with how the test works and how you should approach the questions.
Start off by just having a look at all the different types of questions from all the different subtests and just getting used to those questions and taking as long as you need to answer those questions until you get to the point where you're able to answer them confidently and you feel quite familiar with those questions.
As with any exam, a revision plan is essential to ensure you maximise your success.
I found that my preparation was much less stressful after I had a clear idea of how I was going to prepare for the test.
As I refined my technique, I started to integrate more time practice into my revision, and after each time practice paper I would still go back through it and analyse each question individually.
When you get a question wrong, read through what the right answer is and think about why you put your answer and why that's different from the right answer, and then try to apply that to the more practice questions that you do.
However, don't study for hours on end. A few hours a day studying is more than enough.
I found doing little and often a great way to revise for the UCAT. It really helped prevent me from burning out while I was preparing, which can be a common issue in those of you studying for the test.
There are so many resources online. I don't know if people still say that you can't practice for the UCAT, but it is absolutely. Obviously you can practice for the UCAT, everybody practices for the UCAT. Online is the best way to practice, because remember that you will be required to sit your test on a computer. So I would recommend using the closest setup that you can find, like make sure you're using a mouse, sitting at a desktop computer preferably with like a separate monitor, because I think that's what they have in the test centres. Most people I know didn't take a course, so don't feel that it's necessary to spend £200-300 on a course.
The decision-making section was updated in 2016, so if you're using any UCAT textbooks or anything like that, make sure that they were published after 2016 so that the decision-making questions in the book are up to date.
As a rough guide for preparation, most people take around 6 weeks.
I booked my test for early August. I then gave myself 4 weeks to go through each of the sections in detail, taking a section a week and spending about 2 to 3 hours each day.
And then doing full practice tests in the week before.
That year I had worked probably over 2 months on the UCAT. I worked a lot harder in the few days working up to my test than I did for the full 8 weeks, and had I worked that hard every day for 8 weeks, I definitely would have burnt out and I wouldn't have done well.
I booked my test for the end of July and spent around 3 weeks studying for around 6 hours a day. In hindsight, I probably should have studied over a longer period of time, perhaps 4 or 5 weeks.
It's all about judging yourself and judging how long you think it's going to take you to prepare.
Timing is probably the most difficult part of the test. If you had all day to sit the test, you'd get full marks. So the most important factor in improving your timing is practice. The more you practice, the quicker you'll get at answering questions.
I would recommend becoming really familiar with the keyboard shortcuts, online calculator and the flagging options.
I highly recommend becoming familiar with the flag and review feature of the UCAT test.
If a question is too difficult, then just flag it and move on. Some questions have too much data to handle and/or could require up to 5 calculations. Guess an answer, flag it and move on. You can always come back and review at the end.
Don't waste time on one question, because time is your biggest enemy in the UCAT, and you just need to bang through them, and then hopefully at the end, if you have enough time, you can go back to your flagged ones and you can think more about which answer would be best.
I remember thinking that I didn't really need to focus on these technical aspects as they didn't seem that important, but I was wrong. Knowing these features will save you so much time in the real exam.
And you can practice this by using the tour tutorial on the UCAT website, which shows you the layout and the format of the test. Try and eliminate answers which must be false. First, start off by eliminating false answers. Then, even if you start to run out of time and just have to guess, you've still increased the probability of you getting the question right.
Additionally, I would recommend maximising the 1 minute reading time at the start of each section. I know of some people who just skipped it and went straight on to the next section. However, personally, I wanted to maximise the amount of time to prepare for moving on to the next section. All the sections are really different and require different ways of thinking, so to use the time to breathe and run through the next section in your head. The timing for VR is really difficult. Reading a long passage in such a short space of time can be really stressful.
But it's important that you don't prioritise speed over accuracy. I find that I did this particularly in the verbal reasoning section. If I tried to rush through the questions too quickly to keep up to speed, I would get half of them wrong. I found for that section it was a better idea to go a little bit slower, and that way the questions that I did answer, I got the majority of them right, and then even if I had to guess the last couple of questions, overall I got a much better score by just going a little bit slower.
Succeeding in VR is dependent on your ability to skim read.
This is something that you can do all the time in your everyday life. Anytime you have to read something, try skimming through the text and picking out the important information. The quicker you get at reading, the quicker you'll get at answering the questions on the UCAT test. And speed reading is particularly useful for the verbal reasoning section.
It's so important not to read the passage first. You'll end up taking way too long digesting all of the information, and then when you go back to read the actual question, you'll have to reread the passage again to find the answer. This means you will run out of time. You're not meant to read the whole passage. Most sentences are fillers and are designed to waste your time. I would advise reading the question, pick out the keyword, and then skim the passage to find the keyword. Then read the sentence before the keyword and after the keyword, and you should hopefully find your answer there.
Select out the relevant information from the question. And a lot of the questions you will see, there will be so much information, so much data which is irrelevant. So I would recommend writing down the important pieces of information from the question on your whiteboard so you can easily refer back to them when doing calculations. Practice using the online UCAT calculator. And I can't stress enough how important this is.
I found that the calculator was quite clumsy and difficult to use, so if you practice using it as much as possible, you make sure that that's not the thing that slows you down on the day.
Since it's a basic calculator, you are only able to perform one function at a time. This means you have to record any numbers which aren't your final answer on the whiteboard, so don't forget them. The next piece of advice is learn to eyeball. Eyeballing is where, using your own judgment, you select the correct answer without doing calculations. For example, if I asked you what is 100 divided by 10.1, you would already know that the answer is roughly 10. It can't be 5 and it can't be 15 because these numbers are either too low or too high. Eyeballing is a really good way to save time on the easier questions, which will then allow you to spend more time answering the difficult ones. There are also keyboard shortcuts on the numpad that I would recommend learning to save you time so you don't have to keep clicking on the screen.
With all the questions in the abstract reasoning section, I would advise practicing without a timer when you're just starting out. This isn't a type of question you're likely to have been faced with before, so it'll take your brain a little bit of time to get used to this style of question. If you do find this section hard, make sure you practice it more rather than less, because the only way you're actually going to get any better at it is if you practice. For the Set A and Set B questions, I would advise developing your own systematic way of looking for the pattern. When I was preparing for this type of question, I came up with a little list of things that commonly came up in the patterns, such as number of shapes, the colour of shapes, number of sides on the shapes, symmetry, etc., and worked through this list with each question. I generally found that I would find the pattern much quicker this way rather than just staring at it. There will also be lots of distractions included in a number of the questions. It can be really easy to waste a lot of time focusing on these distractions, so I would do your best to identify and then ignore them. So for example, if you're working through a question and there doesn't seem to be any relationship between colour either in Set A and Set B or between them, ignore it. It means colour is not likely to be part of the pattern for this question.
The SJT especially was probably the subtest that I practiced the most for, because it is so subjective. The answers are so difficult to get the bang on right answer, and I had to practice loads, and then I got a band 1 in my UCAT. Integrity, perspective and ability to work with people tend to be the values that are tested the most by the SJT, and they tend to come up a lot. Also questions involving sort of selflessness and also putting patients first. So those are always the things that you keep in mind. If you see that in a question, immediately just put patients first, be selfless, etc. The GMC guidelines, Good Medical Practice, states what is expected of a doctor when they graduate from medical school. It's not that long to read, and it is really useful to read, especially just as a medical student who's applying. It would be really great to mention in interviews, and this is basically what the SJT is basing their questions on. So 2 commonly tested values are integrity. So this is all about being honest, being transparent, holding people accountable for what they're doing. So for example, lying to cover up a mistake is always very inappropriate. And they also test teamwork. So teamwork is all about supporting your colleagues, doing what is asked of you, and for example, if you are given a responsibility and the question is like that you want to sponge it off on someone else, that is always very inappropriate. Listening to or reassuring a patient is always very appropriate or very important. Obviously putting a patient first is always right at the forefront of every medical interaction. Always prioritize clinical emergencies for the safety of the patient. So if the patient's clinical need is not an emergency and there's something more urgent that needs tending to, then probably that response would be appropriate but not ideal. Because obviously if there's something more urgent, you need to prioritize, but you also want to put the patient first, so it would be appropriate but not ideal. These questions are all based on the values and skills expected of members of the medical profession. Therefore, the best tip that I can give you is to think like the perfect doctor. Think about what they would do, what they would value above all, and what skills would be expected of them. Ignore what you would do as a human being with emotions and desires to like yell at a rude person, because you have to think about what the perfect doctor would do. Don't be too discouraged if you don't do well in the SJT section. I know medical students who got bands 3s and they're still here and they're still going to be great doctors.
I found that this was one of the most difficult aspects of the test because there are so many different types of questions within this section. So when you're practicing, you have to make sure that you practice all the different types of questions that might come up. For the syllogisms questions, it's important that you really read through the question carefully. Often the wording of these questions is quite complicated and cryptic. I found that a good strategy for this section was to take the information that you're given in the scenario and find a different way of presenting it in order to help you figure out and visualise the problem. So for example, if you're given a block of text with a whole load of information in it, you can transfer that into a diagram or a table, and that can help you to figure out the answer. I said before that some people like to keep a close eye on the clock. So for this section, if after a minute has passed they've not been able to figure out the answer, they would just guess and move on to the next question in order to keep their speed up. I found that this was really not a good strategy for this particular section because of the fact that there are so many different types of questions and some of them just take more time than others. Typically, logic puzzle type questions take much longer than syllogism type questions to answer. And so that strategy of watching the clock and moving on isn't so helpful here.
You can reschedule or cancel your test up to 24 hours beforehand if you're sitting it in a test centre. You obviously want to sit the test on the date that you're planning to do it by, but the UCAT is such an important component of your application that it's just not worth trying to stick to a test date even though you're not ready yet and just doing it, because you can only sit it once and then you have to wait a year if it doesn't go as well as you would have liked. I would recommend rescheduling for a bit later, for example a couple of weeks if you don't feel ready. In my case, I was supposed to sit my UCAT in August, late August, and then in the weeks going up I just felt totally unprepared. I was scared, I was stressed out because school was starting again and I was busy trying to get ready going back to school, and I didn't feel ready to sit the test. I then rescheduled my test for late September instead, so I delayed it by about 3 weeks. And in the 3 weeks leading up to it, I did more practice questions, I did loads of practice tests online, and I worked really hard in especially the few days leading up to the test. So then that year, in 2018, I placed in the 98th percentile by some miracle of God. Had I sat the test on my original test date in August, I know that I wouldn't have done as well as when I sat it in September, and that UCAT score probably definitely helped me get to where I am now.
Thank you so much for watching our video on student advice about taking the UCAT. We really hope you found it helpful, and best of luck when it comes to taking the test.
And I wish you the best of luck for your test.
Good luck.
I hope you find this helpful.
Good luck, guys.